Now that you have found a place that is in good condition, you will need to review the lease and work with the landlord. Tenant is the person leasing or renting the apartment. Sometimes instead of using the word tenant, they use the word resident, which means the same thing. The landlord is the person who owns the building or rents the apartment to you. Sometimes they use the word owner. The tenant often don't deal directly with the landlord, but you may deal with a property manager who works for the landlord. When you submit a rental application, the landlord may charge you an application screening fee. Screening fees are processing fees to run background checks and credit checks on the tenants. Make certain the document the landlord gives you is an application form, not a lease. You should not agree to sign a lease until you are sure the apartment and the terms of the lease are right for you. The lease may also be called a rental agreement. Here are some example sections that are typically in a lease. Remember, every lease is different. Read your lease carefully. Terms. In the lease, it should say how long the terms of the lease last. The lease can also be a month-to-month lease. That means that either the tenant or the landlord can cancel the lease if they give you the proper notice. If the tenant or the landlord wants to cancel the lease, they will need to give notice at least 20 days before the end of the month. In some situations, they may need to give more than 20 days notice before the end of the month. In the lease, it should say how much the rent is and when it is due. Sometimes the landlord wants you to mail it in or hand it in person. A security deposit is money that you pay upfront before you move in, and the landlord is required to return your security deposit if you comply with the lease. Some landlords might charge a cleaning fee. Fees are money that you pay and don't get back. If you pay both a deposit and a fee, you will get your deposit back if you comply with the lease, but you won't get your fee back. In the contract, it should say who will pay for water, electricity, sewer, and garbage. The contract will also say who is responsible to pay and fix repairs. There are very few situations in a residential lease when the tenant should ever be responsible for repairs unless the damage was caused by the tenant. Tenants should not sign a lease that holds the tenant responsible for repairing items that the landlord owns. Though, the lease may require the tenant to be responsible for maintaining the smoke detectors and replacing batteries in the smoke detectors. The tenant and the landlord or the property manager should walk through the house before the tenant moves in and write down a list of everything that is already damaged, so that the tenant does not get charged for those problems when the tenant moves out. Also, the tenant should get a copy of the lease and the list signed by the landlord. All communication between your landlord and you should be in writing. If you tell him to fix something and he says he will fix it by a certain day, that should be in writing. Under the law, the landlord is required to give you a receipt if you ask for one. It is always a good idea to ask for a receipt. If you violate a term of your lease, then the landlord can give you a written notice that you must comply with the lease, and if you continue to violate your lease, then the landlord can try to evict you by filing a court case. Even if the owner doesn't enforce this rule in this agreement, that doesn't mean you are allowed to violate them. For example, in the lease, pets aren't allowed in your building, but you have a bird and your landlord knows and says you can keep it. You may still be given a fine for violating the no pets rule of the lease. If the landlord seems to be allowing you to do something that is not in the lease, ask the landlord to give you a new lease that reflects your new arrangement. If the landlord doesn't do that, then they can still enforce the provision even though they seem to be letting you break the lease.